Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to GIS-211. We're working now with Chapter 3 in the book. And excuse my voice, I'm battling some laryngitis that's left over from which was initially flu and then bronchitis, and now I'm left over with laryngitis. Over the last 2 weeks, I've been battling a little bit of everything, it seems like. So just bear with me. Hopefully you can understand me okay. I've been waiting a little while to make this recording so that I can try to recover a little bit. In Chapter 3, we start to really move ahead in the book into some important concepts, but there's some complications that arise in the book, I guess you could say. And so I'm hoping I can clarify a few things in this video and keep you moving forward with this material that I find very fascinating. Hopefully you do too. Unfortunately, with the little glitches that creep up, can be just enough sometimes to really trip you up and discourage you. So I'm here to hopefully encourage you and, like I say, try to keep you moving forward with the material. And let me just say also that just remember there's not an exam over this material, so you can relax a little bit in that you don't have to feel like you totally understand this inside and out once you work through it. And I can tell you from my own experience, I am not a programmer, and I went through this material a number of times in the chapter before I began to get a grasp on it. So don't feel bad if you go through it the first time and you're just totally baffled. Just be patient, hang in there, and go through it again and try to follow some of the little tips and tricks that I'm going to try to show you throughout the video that I think will keep you going ahead and applying some of this material, hopefully. So I'll try to move through it at a pace that's comfortable and keeps you working. So in Chapter 3, in the beginning of the chapter, the author introduces the concept of GeoXML and GeoXML. Okay, now we've been talking about GeoXML, and I'm talking about the stuff he's got highlighted down here in the little box at the bottom, and he's just pointing out the differences between the two. And the GeoXML is just referring to, it's like a generic term, he points out, that refers to standardized XML, which we've talked about in the earlier chapters. Specifically for our purposes, mainly KML files, but it also could be GeoRSS files and maybe some other varieties that's out there. It's mainly the data that you're going to, what he calls, quote, consume with your programs and stuff that you write. And that's a good way of looking at it. It may seem a little strange at first, but it's a good way of looking at it, is that you're writing programs that are going to consume, especially when the user uses these programs, they're going to be consuming standardized, mainly KML files, for our purposes, that exist out there already in some cases, or that you can actually create yourself. And the author doesn't go into a lot of details about creating them yourself because it's not assumed when you do this book that you know and understand GIS or ArcGIS for that matter. And it's not assumed that you have a tool that you're going to create KML files with. But now we do have a variety of tools we can do that with. So I'm going to try to show you some examples a little later on about that. But he's assuming mostly that you're going to be consuming it from other sources that may exist out there in other websites that you're going to pull this information from. And that gets back into the whole idea of the mashup. Remember again, the mashup is taking data from multiple locations, putting it sort of into one program that you're creating and presenting that program to the user. So when the user actually uses that program, they're not aware necessarily that the data that they're accessing in that program is coming from a variety of sources. So that's the idea of the mashup, and that was one of the big emphases of this book. Now the other term here, the GeoXML, and notice the difference in the case here. We've got a capital G and a capital G, and then a lowercase GEO, and then a capital X, but lowercase XML. In the previous one, it all starts with lowercase, and then the XML is in uppercase. And he explains the differences in those two and how that can help you to understand the differences between these two terms in this case. But it mainly gets into what you're using for geodata that you're putting in your program versus JavaScript objects that you're using in the program and things like that. But the GeoXML, okay, is a JavaScript object that exists in the Google Maps API. Now, it exists in our version 2 of the API, and I honestly can't tell you if it exists in version 3 or not, because as I said before, I'm not real familiar with version 3. But it's an important object in our version, and it's important in the code that we're going to be using in the book. So it's important that you understand the difference between these two. So be sure to read this terminology box and read the chapter pretty carefully in this beginning so you understand kind of what's going on. And the author, even though he claims he's not going to teach you JavaScript, he does a really good job, I think, of teaching you the basics of JavaScript. And he does cover this terminology differences and stuff, and it will help you if you understand that somewhat, because you'll use it again in later chapters. So read this first part pretty carefully, and I think it will help you. And then he begins to get into the examples that are in the book. And now this is where we'll run into a little bit of problem, namely the KML files that he's trying to use for you to consume in the book chapters. Some of those don't exist any longer. And realize this is it's unfortunate, but it's going to be the case with any book. Within a year of coming out, there's a good chance that examples such as this, the source code is going to change. And in some cases, these files exist somewhere else. They may have been renamed or moved to another server. And in some cases, you can actually find them. And I was able to find one of the ones he uses in here. But I was not able to find the stuff he refers to in these first couple examples, which deals with a Placeopedia site, which is kind of a spin-off, I think, of a Wikipedia. And it looked like it was a real interesting site. And I do remember when it actually was working. But I believe, if my understanding is correct, they phased that site out now. And so the examples he uses in these first two cases, the data source that he's trying to use is not out there. And so it makes it initially a little tough to work through the material. But I'm going to show you kind of a way around that, and we're going to borrow some other examples to do that with so that we can focus on the concepts he's trying to introduce in his code here. Okay. Now, this listing 3.1, this is a JavaScript code. So in chapter 2, he walked you through the three basic types of coding that we talked about before. Remember the HTML file, the CSS file, and the JavaScript or JS file. Now in this chapter he begins to mix it up a little bit because he's assuming you'll remember some of the other material and you don't have to rewrite all the other material from scratch. So for example, the HTML file, which I like to think of as your initial file that you need, he doesn't even give you that in the code in this chapter. So if you look in the code, which give me a minute to switch windows here. Okay, I've switched windows here to where I'm in my working folder on the C drive that hopefully you're working with as well. And in the code, you'll notice there's not even an HTML file in the sample code for chapter 3. This testing folder is something that I created already as I was working with the material, so don't worry about that for right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to move up into the chapter 2 folder and borrow the last HTML file that we created in there. And I'm just going to use the one out of the book. I had some that I was playing with that I had edited on my own. And we'll use this listing 0203, which if I remember correctly was the last HTML file from that chapter. And we'll just borrow that and put it back in our chapter 3 folder. That way we'll have one of each of the types. He does give you the CSS file, and he makes a couple little additions, but not much to that one. And then these 3 JavaScript files are the different iterations he walks you through in the chapters. So what I'm going to do is set my windows up like I encouraged you to do when you're working with these on your own. So the way I have it set up, I have my Windows Explorer open here in the top left. I have my browser open here in the top right, and I'll talk more about this in a minute. And in the bottom here, I've got my Notepad++ open. So I've got my editor open down here in the bottom. I've got my source files here in the upper left, and I've got my browser that I'm going to use for testing my coding here on the upper right. Now, if you have two monitors, this is where it really comes in handy, having two monitors. You can rearrange this and use a full window for your browser, for example, and maybe split your window in two on the left side between your source code and your editor. I have two monitors running, but I can't get my screen capture to get them both at the same time. So I'm operating it here as if I only have one monitor. And so again, if you have two monitors, this is where it really pays off, having two monitors. If you're working on a laptop, this is where you'll see one of the disadvantages of a laptop, is that you just don't have the screen space in a lot of cases that you'd like to have. So, but you can get it to work, and you can work it with one monitor just fine. You can work it on a laptop just fine. It might be just a little more tedious, and you don't have to arrange it this way. Arrange it any way that's comfortable to you. This is just a way that I find that works pretty good for me, and so I'm sharing it with you in these examples. So what I've done here in the bottom in my notepad is I've opened up the three versions of the JavaScript files and the CSS file. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up the HTML file that I brought in. And one nice thing I like about Notepad++ again is I can just drag it and drop it in there, and it will open it up in another tabbed window. So I can go between files just by clicking the tabs across the way again, which is nice. So let's start with the HTML file. And even though, again, this was from Chapter 2, what's important is, of course, the coding more so than your naming. If this were a final version of the file, I think it would be handy to have it the same name as the JavaScript file and the CSS file. That way I would know that they all match up at a glance. And when you're building products that you're going to keep and not just practicing with, you want to be real careful to do that. It's easy to get a little sloppy and ignore that, and I do that myself a lot, and you'll see that in some of my little testing folders, because you'll see a lot of different names in there. But you'll see what I mean as you're working through this. So let's go through on the HTML file again. Remember, that's basically your initial startup file. Whatever name that's called, that's the name your user would type in to open the application. And so you want to use a nice creative name again there on your final products. But your HTML file, remember, is basically your navigator page, and it also sets up your web page. So what this does is, and I'm going to drag it into, it might not open correctly because it's pulling from whatever I had in Chapter 2, which I can't even remember what that was, but I'm going to go ahead and drag it in there anyway and just see what happens. Well, it looks like it's not going to open right, so I'm going to go back to the page I was on. But anyway, your HTML file contains the initial information about your page title, and it contains the link to your CSS file and the link to your JavaScript file. So here's the CSS file link, and here's the JavaScript file link. Now you'll notice the part that's in quotes is the actual file name. And this is where you would include a path as well. And now that I've asked you or encouraged you to set up a Google website, then you'll begin to see why in this chapter. Because what we've done thus far is we've kept our source code in the same subfolder on our base desktop computer. And so we didn't have to put a path in here for that reason. Because the files, if you look at them up here in the top, the files existed in the same folder. So when we open the HTML file and when we execute it in our browser, it opens which is why it didn't open correctly, by the way, because I don't have the files that it's referring to are the Chapter 2 files, and they're not in that same subfolder any longer. So I've broken my link essentially, which is why it wouldn't open the page over here. We'll fix that in a minute. But essentially what happens is the HTML file opens in the browser, and it executes each of these other files to open. And as long as they're in located where you've got them here listed in your code, which in this case again is basically saying look in the same subfolder, because we're not telling it to go anywhere else. then it's going to look for them in that same subfolder, and if they're there, it will open them as it executes them in the browser. Okay. Now let me change gears just a little bit here. In the browser, I've got open my basic web page that I encourage you to create in Google Sites. And I'm not going to go in a lot of detail about creating that because I've already touched on it before, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Google walks you through some basics of it creates just a basic site for you pretty easily. And all you really needed to have at this point, you don't need a fancy website. You can see mine's not fancy at all. But what I wanted you to create was a file cabinet to store some files in. And so once I set up my home page, I created I just called it BGMM to stick with the same code name that's in our book. And I set it up to be a file cabinet, okay? And if you're in I'm going to see if I can walk through it. It's been a little while since I made mine, so I'm going to see if I can remember now how you do that and to demonstrate real quickly for you. So just bear with me here. I'm going to change gears and go over to my main Google Sites page. You can see I have a few sites I've created, which you can do as well, which is kind of neat. You can create multiple websites if you like. What I'm going to use for this example is the one I called the RSS. When you're ready to create a new file cabinet, I already have one in here that called BGMM again that you can see. But to create, if I wanted to create another one, what I could do is up here at the top is go over to New Page, and then I can name the page. So let's just call it. I'm going to call it Data Files. And change this switch from web page to file cabinet. And then it wants to select a location. And I don't really want to, let's see, put it at the top level or under home. And I'm going to put it under home. I believe that's the way we want to do this. I haven't done one in a while, so we'll see if this works. My BGMM appeared to be under home, yes. So you can see here, home is always my top level, and I like to keep home that way because that's the page that you would see first when you go to my website. But now when you're under home, you'll notice I have two other locations, and these are both file cabinets, the type that I use because that's the template I selected. So I've got my BGMM that has a bunch of files that I've been working with and practicing with already in it. And then I've created a new one called Data Files that is blank right now, and it's ready to load files onto it. So I can add files, I can delete files, and once files are on there, I can manage files a little bit. I can add a link, which is basically would pull a file from another location and copy it over to here. So, but this is what I wanted you to create because it will give you a location to save some of your data files that we're going to work with in our practicing. And that's what I wanted mainly for you to get to. Not so much a fancy home page right now, but a place that had a file cabinet where you could upload files to. So, so that was what I was wanting you to do, and hopefully that makes sense on how to do that. And now let me shift gears again here and go back to where we were in the coding. So when we're in our HTML code, remember the HTML, it pulls a CSS file, which I loaded already here. And they've called it 0304 because that was the order in the chapter that they came to when they put it in there. And if you look through that file, it's basically pretty much the same as what we had, and maybe exactly the same as what we had in when we used the last one in chapter 2. So it doesn't look like anything has really changed here. And this is, again, just basically think of it as the structure behind your page. It's telling it to use 100%, for example, of your page for your map and so forth. And it's setting 0 margin, so basically your map's going to take up all of your page at this point. And then the HTML file also calls the JavaScript file. And he starts off with this version 1, and which basically introduces the Placeopedia file that we talked about earlier. And if you go through the code, which I'm going to let you look through the book, remember in the book he highlights sections of the code that is new that you want to take a look at. So as he builds on it, I'm switching back here, if we look in this listing 3.1, one of the things he has in bold is this variable he's defining called GIS-211. And then if you scroll down through the code, he also changed the latitude and longitude, so where the map is going to center is going to vary. And he's set a different zoom level, the number 4 there for the zoom level. And then he's added this line, these 2 lines of code here, which basically assigns a KML file to the GIS-211 variable. And if you look at the path in there, the location that he is giving you for where that KML file resides, again, it's on the Placeopedia site, which doesn't exist right now. So therefore, this one won't run correctly if you try to execute it. And just to demonstrate that, I'm going to walk through that so that you'll understand the logic behind it there. And if we go back to our HTML file, we need to switch a couple things here. We need to change the name of the CSS file because it's not chapter 2 any longer. We're using this one here in chapter 3, so we need the 0304 there. So let's change that. And now this is very meticulous. There's no forgiving here. You have to make sure you get this exactly right. So you have to be very careful, and a lot of times if something doesn't work as expected when you're running your code, 9 times out of 10 you'll find a little typo in one of the names or the pathways. And it's happened to me 1,000 times, I guess. So I'm sure it will happen to you too. And so just be patient and go through your code, and again look at your file names because usually that's where the problem is. So here we switch it to listing 0304. It resides in the same subfolder as our HTML file, so we do not have to include any path information here. In our JavaScript file, it's also different. We're going to use the 03 instead of 02, and instead of 06, we're going to use 01 in this case, just to set an example. I like how Notepad highlights in red whenever you've edited a file. If you look at the name up here in the tabs, you'll know that file's not been saved. We don't want to execute anything till we save it, or else it won't see our changes. So I saved it there. And remember this key we've talked about before. Right now, this is just the key that the author had that he stuck in there. And we can ignore the key for now. We'll leave that in there. It's not going to have any impact on our file right now because our files all reside on our local hard drive anyway, for one thing. So it wouldn't matter. We don't need the key. But if once we start using them on web pages, we would need a key. And I've shown you how to get a new key with the new procedures in a separate video. But for now, we'll just leave this like it is in here because it won't affect our code. And and then we'll go ahead and what I want to do to execute the HTML file, I could type it all in here into my browser, but I'm just going to drag it and drop it, which is why I had you set up the windows side by side. And so I'll drag it and drop it, and it executes it. And now the only thing that we've added by doing this in this chapter so far is we're now using an external KML file that exists out there on somebody else's website, and we basically put it into a mashup, and we're trying to run it through our a Google map through our own coding. And in this case, we get the map of the US. It's centered the coordinates like he set it up in the JavaScript file, or JavaScript 1 there. And so the lat long is properly executed and the zoom level is executed, but we don't see any data because, again, that Placeopedia site does not exist. Okay. Now, if we jump ahead to the second JavaScript file that he introduces in the chapter, and we'll come back to some of the intents of these codes in a minute. Here's what we should have got something like this. Of course, he points out that even this would look different because what he's doing is he's pulling some of the latest entries from that Placeopedia site, and they change every day because it basically was a site that was attempting to put a location to some of the information that exists in Wikipedia into their site. And so that's this dynamic. It was changing all the time, which is part of the idea of the mashup. But again, the site's not there, so we're not seeing anything. But this is something like what we would have hoped to have seen. It might not have been in the same locations, but it would have been something like this. And we could have clicked on one of the bubbles or one of the markers, and an info bubble would have popped up. And then he moves in to he explains a little bit about the value of Google's caching, which is important to read that just to get a grasp of what he's getting at there. And he explains some of the code that was in the JavaScript file. And then we eventually get to the second listing, which the only really thing new in the second listing, if you scroll through it, is he's added a factor that would limit that code from Placeopedia to show just the first 5 results, or the last 5 results, I guess. And then he executes a function here called XML loaded. And as he explains in the chapter, what XML loaded does basically is it zooms your window to where it zooms in to the extents of the 5 points that you're using in this case. And it's kind of neat because it will automatically zoom your view window to whatever that extent is. So it's going to change in that case. There might be a different 5 2 days from now that you used, and it would automatically rezoom to that window. And this is kind of important to remember this because I think it's very handy. He does not use it in the third one, and it's something that you can use. So remember this function, and we'll probably be back to it at a certain point. But just to show you what it should have done if the Placeopedia site existed, is here it picked the 5 most recent results, and it zoomed to their extent in the window. Again, instead of showing the US, the coordinates in his code, but still says zoom to the US level at zoom number 4. But by having this function at the end of the code, is it then recenters the map to the extents of those 5 markers again. And you could actually see this in the code. If the Placeopedia site were there, you could see it initially jump to the US, and then it would zoom into this area. So it's a pretty handy function. And that's basically what he added with the second JavaScript. Okay, so just for the sake of consistency, I've got the second JavaScript loaded here, and you can see this is the same thing he had in the book. And here in kind of the light gray color is the link to that Placeopedia site, which again doesn't exist, so we wouldn't really get any change in our map, right? If we execute it just for fun, if we go in our HTML file and change our JavaScript listing from 01 to 02, which is really all we have to do here, we're going to keep that CSS file. We save that, and I can drag it and drop it in here, or I can just refresh, right? Because I've used the HTML file to get this view, so I can just refresh it, and it's going to stay the same in this case because there was no data from Placeopedia. If there were, it would have zoomed to that data and you would have seen that. So we'll substitute some data here in a minute, and you can sort of see how that works. But let's go ahead and jump to the third CSS or third JavaScript file for now, because again he doesn't add a whole lot more, but this is where we're going to pick up with our examples. So if we scroll through, he's pointing out that what you can do with the GGOXML function is you can also start to add more information besides just markers, which this is very powerful. We can add more of the kinds of things that we would create in ArcGIS, for example. And he shows you some XML or some KML files that he's borrowed from other locations to put into Mashup to demonstrate this with. And one of them was the map gadgets for the polylines and polygons. And I haven't actually retried that myself, so I'm going to do that now, just because it did work at one time, and I don't know if it's still there or not, or if it's like the Placeopedia. So I'm kind of curious myself about that now. So let's try that. Let's just see on the fly if this works or not. So I'm going to highlight just his text here out of the book, but you can type it in your case. And I'm going to replace the code. And actually what I'm going to do is instead of putting it in the third JavaScript, I'm going to go back to the second one and basically just replace that Placeopedia code with this other site to see if it works. So we're doing this on the fly, so it's always a little risky here. Let's just see. So I've copied and pasted it real carefully, keeping my quotation marks around the file name. I'll save that. And let me just make sure I did have it to set to 2. Yep, in my HTML. So I'm going to refresh this, and let's just see what happens. Okay, it's working. So did you see what happened there? Were you able to follow that? Let me maximize this window. And let's go. Let's see, actually, if I go back, it's not going to demonstrate. Let me just refresh again. And watch how it zooms to the extent of the U.S., and then it zooms in automatically into the Chicago area. So you saw it went pretty quickly that time because it was loaded in the cache. Let me do it one more time. You see the U.S. pop up, and then it immediately zooms right into the Chicago area because that KML data source still exists. And what it's done is we've still got the code in there that zoomed to the viewport. And so that's why I still use the number 2 version of the JavaScript, because in the number 3 he drops that viewport, that automatic zooming to the viewport out. So here we've got some line features, and he's just showing you that, and you can actually click on these lines, I believe, and it will pop up just some information about, this is the transit system, I guess, around Chicago, some information. And I notice sometimes if you click on a line and you get a blank info bubble, click on it again. I've noticed that a lot, and I don't know if it's a glitch in Google or if we're just zoomed out too far, but sometimes you have to click more than once to get the bubble to populate with information. I had to do it there twice as well. Not much in there, but his point was just to show you that you can also use other features besides points. So we've got some line features there that he used. And let's go back to the book again. And he also used an example with polygons. And in this source, he got them from this site, Media Juice. And I did test this, and it does work also. So let me highlight the code there. I'm just, again, unless you've got the digital version of the book, you probably won't be able to do this, but you can type it in. So I'm going to copy it. I didn't get the H there at the beginning, but I'll just add that manually. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it back in my code. Let me get my window back like I had it. And in my JavaScript code, I'm going to replace that previous link with this new one. Make sure I go back and add the H there to my HTTP. And then I'm going to save that. And so we've got this KML file from a totally different source. And we'll go back and just, I'm going to enlarge the window and then refresh it. And we should see something similar. It goes to the U.S., and then it's zoomed into the Florida area where that code resided. Or rather, where the KML file, source file, came from. And in this case, it's a little more interesting. If we click on the polygons, they're basically counties in Florida, and it's showing you the different, how many people per square mile existed in that county. So this is pretty neat, and at least these links are working. So the Placeopedia seems to be the only one that's not. And so hopefully you can see what was going on there. Again, we've introduced a few things. We've introduced this viewport zooming function that automatically zooms in. We've introduced that you can load more than just markers. You can also have polygons, polylines, which is stuff we can create with ArcGIS. And then now let me shift gears again just a little bit before we move on in the book. I wanted to show you that you can actually create your own KML files. So, he shows you at the end of the chapter a method you might want to use to locate some KML files on your own, which is pretty neat. You can follow through that, and you might have some success with that. Be careful, however, when you're looking, when you're searching in one case, he shows you how you can go just to the file type, say look for just file types that are KML. And that's really powerful, but realize that what you might be getting there is an actual KML file link. So you want to know what it is. So you're going to want to go to maybe the home page of where that link came from to see if you can track down what it is. But it is a way you can locate some KML files. And I was able to locate the file that he used. One of the other links was broken, where he used I think an office location up in British Columbia, and he had a transit system in that area, and the link was broken to that. I noticed it didn't work, and I was able to search for that, and I found the actual file. They had just renamed it, And so you might try that on your own, see if you can find it. But what I wanted to point out is that you can use ArcGIS to create your own KML files. And I'm going to do a real quick one here just for an example. While my ArcGIS is loading, let me go to the third JavaScript file real quick, because basically what he reintroduced in that, and I've set it up here in my notepad already, is he added the marker, that the point marker, and he pointed out how you can add information to that point marker. In this case, he added an office, and he added an address, and he had a different source. Again, he had this source down here for another KML file, which was basically, as I mentioned before, the transit system around the office location he was pointing out in British Columbia. So let me just run that code as it is. Remember, I need to go back to my HTML file and change that source. Well, it looks like my ArcGIS is popping up in our window here. So hang on just a second here. Okay, and in the HTML file, I'm going to change that to the third JavaScript file. Save that, and then let's maximize our browser window, and I'm going to refresh it, and that should run the new code. And so you see it opens up. What he wanted to point out is you can add, and this is real useful, and you'll see more of this in the next chapter, but you can populate your own info window here with information that's customized a little bit. And it's also has some formatting to it. So he basically put our office here in bold, and then he put the address under that. And he also had it pop up automatically. So he added a little line of code in there that had a function that basically executed a click function, which if I close this box, had the window open like this, then when you click on the marker, basically that's what his code did for you automatically. So you can turn that on or off, and you can basically have your marker open on its own or not. And so that's kind of handy. And what was supposed to also show here is this transit system, which actually exists on the map here. But if you see these blue markers here, there should have been a line through here that was a transit system from a file that he was loading, again, in the code. If we go back to the code, this line I've highlighted right down here, this keyhole.com. And what I did for fun was I typed that in a search and looked for that, tried to find that code myself. Let me just see if it still works. I'll copy that, and actually that's it. If we lose it, this is what it should look like once you execute it. If you zoomed out a little bit. But I'm going to go ahead and just paste the code in here like I did before. I wanted to demonstrate to you that on some of these cases when stuff is gone, you can still find them. So what I did was I tried to go to that website that he had in there. And if I remember correctly, well, no, actually in this case it did take me somewhere. So that obviously wasn't the one I was thinking about. But it's not opening anything up. Hang on, let me try this again here. Okay, Google's introduced some changes already. This is obviously a Google Groups site that it's going to, and they were letting you know that they've added some changes to their Google Groups site, and it didn't find anything here, and I can't remember if I searched for all groups. Well, now I'm not finding it. It's funny, the first round was different. But anyway, what I did for fun was I tried to find that site on my own. And I was able to find it. And what it did is it took me to a site like this, and it had another option down here that I could look for. And I clicked on that, and it took me basically to that same file. What I assume anyway was that same file. And it had a new name for that file. So I copied that new name and pasted it in my code, and lo and behold, it worked. And rather than dig through it all again, I'll just show you this is what it looked like. And what happened is we were initially zoomed in to, I don't want to refresh it because it will lose the code. So you're initially zoomed into a level something like this when you open up, and your info window, of course, was open automatically. And this is what it should have looked like. Instead of this, we should have had the extra information of this line right through here. I think he was probably zoomed in one more level or something. And it was something like that is how it should have looked. And then we could have clicked on this line for information about that they've tied to their own KML file for their transit system. And you could actually go to the Wikipedia entry, was one of the other things they were pointing out, which was kind of neat. And that was all in the KML file, realized that he was pulling over from this other location. And what I found out was what I did in my view was I practiced with that viewport window that we saw in the second JavaScript file that automatically zooms to the extent of your data. And I was testing it to see if I could get it to work on another example of my own. And that's when I realized what it did is it zoomed to the extent of that KML file, which contained a lot more information than what was showing up in his little example. When you zoom out, this is more like what you saw. And they even have included a raster image in there, which was interesting. And they had a lot of other links to their transit system. And all of these info bubbles, by the way, or these markers, contain info bubbles with them. And so there was information about the transit system throughout, which was kind of interesting. So anyway, I'll leave that up to you if you want to try to find that file. And if I need to, I can maybe re-find it outside of the video and post a link to it or something if you want to get it that way. But the important thing to realize here is that all he's doing is he's using some KML files for sources to feed into his code as examples. And he wanted to demonstrate that what you're doing now is you're adding to your map. Instead of just the marker, okay, instead of just your point, you can go out and get associated KML files that has information about areas around your point as well. So that's where you're really beginning to see some of the power coming in from the mashups now. We're starting to add other layers to our map, and we're basically building out this map. And what I wanted to add to this was the fact that you could do some of this on your own. You can create your own data files and create some of your own KML files to use, since we are lucky enough to have ArcGIS, which creates KML files for you. And so I wanted to run through a quick example of that. Now realize too, another source that you might try is Google Earth. Now Google Earth is also using KML files. And I think I encouraged you in an earlier example to go through and experiment with creating some KML files on your own and putting them in both ArcMap and Google Earth and vice versa. Because you can actually export KML files from both. Now, what's interesting is that you actually, in ArcGIS, actually exports a KMZ file, which is basically a zipped up version of the KML file. And unfortunately, you cannot use something like WinZip to unzip it. So if you run into, they both work in the code, but if you're like me, you kind of like to open things up and look at them, and you can't really open the KMZ file because it's compressed. All you'll get is a lot of funny characters if you try to open it up. You can actually open a KML file, though, and you can learn a little bit about that. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But just wanted to show you that in ArcMap, you could actually load. I'm going to load some data here, and I'm going to pause it while I load it so it saves some time. Okay, so what I've done, I've already created a project here that I was practicing with earlier. Some of you may recognize this if you've looked at some of the federal lands data in one of our other classes. I use this layer in the 110 class. But if, let me just switch views here a second so you can see the larger view. But what I did is I took an existing layer that Esri had created or made available, which was also available from a source called the National Maps. And it's a file that has all of the federal land polygons in it for the U.S. And I first tried to export just this big layer on its own and run it through, and then I found out that the book does mention that there are limitations to the size that the GGOXML object will process, and it looks like that limitation is exceeded if you try to use all of the US files, it blows that limitation out and it won't load the file. And so what I did then is I said, well, let me just look at Tennessee. And so I went through and from some other source data that I had, I went through and created a file just for Tennessee. And so what I did is I got a state boundary and I used that to select from. So I selected anything that any of the federal land layers that intersected Tennessee out of that federal lands layer. And once I had that, I exported that out into a new file, which hopefully all of you should know how to do that by now from working the other classes. But again, all you do basically is I use another polygon in this case, because a lot of the federal lands in Tennessee are also residing outside of Tennessee. So I wanted to basically get anything that had at least a presence in Tennessee. And so I used the state polygon again to select all the federal land features that intersected Tennessee. And this is what I ended up with. So, and the file size was, I'm sure, a lot smaller on this. And so what I did then is I exported this out as it was KMZ in this case, file, and used that as my own data source. And so that was the first thing I did.